Okay, with Hashem's help, we're picking up from chapter 8, Perek Ches, in the book of Shmuel Beis. And when we last left off, David HaMelech was so confident that everything was done and it was time to build a temple. He had conquered the enemies that were the immediate threat, and he was righteous, and everything was in place. So he asked Hashem for permission to build a temple, and the response was no. David, this is not going to be your job. The temple will not be built in your lifetime. You will not build the Beit HaMikdash, but rather your son Shlomo will. That's what we learned last time. So this is exactly where chapter 8 picks up. And I would ask you, have in mind, if your boss told you this is not your job, there's like a very big project that has to be taken care of. It's not your job. We've got a different team working on it. Your descendants will work on this. Is not your job. So if it were up to me, I'd say, okay, check out, and you go do your thing and relax. Tonight is actually not what David did. David, as much as he could not build the Beis HaMikdash, he did everything in his power to bring it as close as possible to being built. And between our chapter and the corresponding chapter in the book of Divrei Hayamim Chronicles, which is the same story with more detail, we see David doing a tremendous amount of prep work for the Beis HaMikdash. We're going to start going through it tonight, God willing. So he was not lazy. He was not trying to shirk any responsibilities. It was David, the servant of Hashem, through and through, just wanted to do the will of Hashem. And anything that he did achieve and he did accomplish, he would directly credit God with. It's an amazing thing. So here we go. Vayihi acharei chen, chapter 8.
Short question.
Yes.
Is this the first time that David knew that his son Solomon would succeed him?
Good question. So the truth is, I kind of spilled the beans. I said Solomon, but Solomon does not exist at this point yet. David first has to meet Bathsheba, and that's from there will come Shlomo. So Hashem doesn't name the son by name. He actually says in the last chapter, it says, the one that will come forth from your loins. He will, that's verse number 12, if you're wondering, in chapter 7, he will be the king. Now, that does indicate that the son that will take over had not been born yet. So it already rules out at least two of the sons of David who were already born. But the one that will come from your loins, which is the future tense. Okay, but you're right. It's not actually Shlomo by name. Hashem, we know what Hashem meant, but David didn't know it yet. Okay, so chapter 8 says, and it was after that, after this occurred. In other words, after David found out that he cannot build the temple, so what does he do? He goes back to war. Back to war. Vayach et plishtim vayach ni'em. He strikes the Philistines. Like if he didn't get enough, he goes now after them and he strikes them. And he takes Meteg Ha'ama miyad plishtim. And he takes this place called Meteg Ha'ama from the hands of the plishtim. So let's just first, the opening words of the chapter are after these things. In other words, after David found out he can't build a temple, so he says, let me now start clearing out the bordering lands from enemies. Until now, he had neutralized the threat. Any imminent threats, any enemies that were actively attacking the Jews, David has neutralized. But now he's saying, okay, the next thing I wanted to do is build a temple now that we're secure. But if I can't do that, then let me enhance our security. Because as we know too well from current events, that even if your own land is safe, if on the border you have enemies, that could be a constant source of tsaros, of pain. So David now is going to expand in various directions, both in Eretz Yisrael and beyond Eretz Yisrael. As we're going to see, he's going to go north and he's going to go south. And he's going to be fighting against those enemies throughout this chapter, again, to solidify the control in Eretz Yisrael and to make it more secure. So he goes after the Plishtim first. The Plishtim had come out to fight David a few chapters ago, and he smashed them utterly. And now he's going into their territory, and he is continuing to strike them. Vayachni Eman, he subdues them, he humbles them, which means like if they're already squished, he squished them further yet to make sure that they will never cause problems for the Jews anymore. And he takes this place called Meteg Ha'ama, which in English is just a proper noun, Meteg Ha'ama. The Radak brings down a fascinating midrash that meteg ha'ama means the strap of the donkey. That there was a particular strap of the donkey which the Plishtim, the Philistines, loved waving in the face of the Jews. This donkey strap dated back all the way to when Yitzchak made a covenant with Avimelech, the Philistine predecessor, the Plishti. They made a covenant that they will not fight against each other. There was actually a reaffirming of the covenant that Avraham had made with the Philistines. And Yitzchak made one as well. And in order to make a reminder of this bris that they made between them, of this covenant, he Yitzchak cut off a strap of the donkey that was his, and he wrote on it that there's a covenant between the Jews and the Philistines that we should not fight against each other. Okay? Now, the Jews had, this covenant had long been expired and become obsolete because the Philistines had violated it. The Plishtim violated it, and there was no longer a need to keep the covenant in terms of the Jews. But they would always wave around this strap and say, hey, you're not allowed to fight against us. Hey, you're not allowed to fight against us, right? Even though it was null and void, but they would wave it around. And that has the potential of making a chilul Hashem. It makes the Jews look bad. Somebody who doesn't know the backstory, doesn't know the terms of the covenant or the history between the Jews and the Plishtim, they would see the documentation, they would see this donkey strap, and they'd say, hey, look at these Jews are violating the bris. It would be a chilul Hashem. It would be a desecration of Hashem's name. And therefore, when David went down to attack the Plishtim, he made sure that he got meteg ha'ama. He made sure he got this donkey strap. A fascinating midrash from the Radak. Those of you who recall, there was a very similar story with David coming to attack the Yevusi, which were also descendants of Avimelech when he was trying to solidify his control over Yerushalayim. Similar type of story over there. And now we'll go on. Okay, so he strikes the Plishtim. Next stop is Moab. This is verse number 2. Vayach et Moab, vaymadedem b'chevel hashkevosam arza. He strikes the Moabites. There's a problem with this because there's a pasuk in Torah that Moshe is told, Al tatzar et Moab al tidgar bar milchama, not to start war with the Moabites, which the Ramban suggests is an eternal mitzvah, that it's forbidden for us because David himself was descended from Rus, the Moabite. It's forbidden for us to conquer their land. And here you have David striking the Moabites. Moab is east of Israel. So it would seem, I think the Ramban there suggests that this is not a violation of that command because he's not conquering their territory. He's just striking them and leaving. And that's why that's not a problem. But now he does something that seems incredibly cruel and un-Jewish. In verse number 3, it says that he measured them with ropes. He laid them down on the ground, and anybody who was 2 rope lengths would die, and anybody who was 1 rope length would live. And the people of Moab ended up becoming servants to David, and they would bring him tribute. Okay, so he does this very, very harsh thing that he executes a number of the Moabites by using this seemingly arbitrary tactic, laying them down on the ground, and he cut out a measure of rope. Anybody who's 1 rope, who fits into 1 rope lives. Anybody who's beyond 1 rope, if it takes 2 ropes to measure you, you die. That sounds like very severe. It is a very uncomfortably reminiscent of things that lahavdil, the Nazis, would do. There's a story, they would put up a post in the ground, and if anybody who is taller than this gets executed. Yeah, so what's going on over here? Why is David being so incredibly harsh? So one interpretation is that the literal meaning here is misleading. Actually, what he did was, a chevel could be a measure. He killed 2 measures of the Moabites. He killed 2/3 of them. He killed 2 and he left 1/3 behind. And it was just talking about the standard warfare. However, many commentaries do go with the plain meaning that he did this like arbitrary thing. By anybody who's taller than this gets executed. And they say that David had a personal issue with the Moabites. You might recall when David was fleeing from Shaul, one of the places he went to was the land of his ancestors, Moab. He went to Moab to seek refuge in hiding from Shaul. He had to leave Israel. And they took in David, and they took in David's whole family, his brothers, his father Yishai, his mother, etc. And as long as David was there, everything was fine. But as soon as David left, the Moabites got up and they executed David's entire family. They murdered David's family. Even Yishai, the righteous Yishai, and all the righteous brothers of David, these were tzaddikim. Yishai was a person who never committed a sin in his lifetime, absolutely righteous, and David's family. Not only that, but it was under the guise of being his friends, right? They first gave him refuge, but as soon as he left, as soon as David left, bam, they turned on him and they executed his entire righteous family. So this is something that was deeply despicable, and David had to or wanted to take vengeance for that cruel actions that the Moabites did to him. The nature of killing somebody like this, like when you do like an arbitrary thing like this, it's like an extra bizayon, it's an extra disgrace because it shows like it doesn't really matter who you are, like fit into this, fit into that, like it's as if you're not even human. It's like an extra degradation. It's a very strange thing. It's uncomfortable, but it says it. And it says it's what he did, and the justification is because of what they did to his family. It could be I was listening to a shir from Rabbi Lichtenstein, and somebody in the audience spoke up and said perhaps he was killing the tall ones because they were a bigger threat. You know, like the bigger people are more likely to come and fight back. Maybe. But that's that. Okay. I don't see anybody's faces, so I'm going to assume that everybody's on board, engaged, and ready to move forward. Let's do it. Let's do it. Okay. Now, David again went to the Plishtim, which seems to be in Israel. It's not clear. The Plishtim lived all over the place. And then he goes to Moab, which is in the east. Now, David goes to Tzova, which is modern day Syria, Lebanon, Syria area. Vayach David is verse number 3. Vayach David Hadad Ezer ben Rechov melech Tzova belechto le'ashiv edo min har Parat. As he was going to extend his hand to the Euphrates. And the har Parat is the Euphrates River, very far out there. I think that's northeast, right? So who was going to the Euphrates to extend their territory? It can be interpreted two ways. That the king of Tzova, the Syria, let's call him Syria, what do we call him? Hadadezer, let's just call him by his name. Hadadezer was on a campaign to expand his territory, and while he was expanding his territory, David came and struck him. Okay, right? You're neighboring us from the north. We don't want you as our enemy just sitting over there, so David struck him down. Alternatively, it could be David who was trying to expand the territory of Eretz Yisrael. And in fact, in some of these battles, David did like annex some of these territories to be a part of Eretz Yisrael. Now there's halachic questions about the lands and the territories that David conquered. This is what is called a kibush yachid. It's an individual campaign to conquer land. It is possible to add on land to Eretz Yisrael. For example, the Transjordan, the Aver Yarden, where Reuven and Gad, this territory is, that was a section that was not originally part of Eretz Yisrael, but after Moshe Rabbeinu and the people won the war, they annexed it and they made it part of Eretz Yisrael. And that became part of Eretz Yisrael proper with all of the laws. David here, although he is a Jewish king and he is conquering territory and calling it theirs, he is working as an individual. Number one, he did not consult with the Sanhedrin before doing this, so it's called an individual campaign rather than a national campaign. And number two, it's only possible to add more territory to the land if you've already conquered everything in your space. So since there were still enemies living within Israel, which were still able to be captured, as opposed to the days of Moshe, since there's still enemies living within Israel, it's not possible to add on any more territory. These are two different approaches to why these are not officially part of Israel. So in the Gemara, I forget the details, but the land has a quasi-Israel status in terms of tithes and things that grow over there. But on the other hand, like you wouldn't keep Shemitah, the Shemitah year, the seventh year, the sabbatical year, because it's not officially Israel. Okay, so in short, David goes north. He strikes down Sova while he was on his way to expand the territory towards the Euphrates River. And then in verse number 4, Vayilko David mimenu 1,700 parashim. David captures 1,700 horsemen V'esrim elef ragli, and 20,000 soldiers, foot soldiers. Vayakir David et kol harechev, vayoter mimenu me'arachiv. And David hamstrings the horses that were pulling the chariots, but he left behind 100 chariots worth of horses. Each chariot, for your information, each chariot takes 4 horses to pull it. And David left behind 100 chariots. That means he left 400 horses alive to pull 100 chariots. He hamstringed the rest of the horses. There were many, right? If there were 1,700, 1,700 horsemen, there's a lot more horses than the 400 David left behind. However, there's a prohibition in the Torah for a king to have too many horses. Lo yarbeh lo susim. A Jewish king may not have too many horses, lest it make him haughty and forget God. So David here could not take all of the horses for himself, although it would be very useful. Or in the middle of campaigning and fighting against all your enemies, it would be very useful to have a nice, what do you call a group of horses in your army? I don't know. It'd be very useful to have a lot of tanks, but he couldn't have too many because of the prohibition in the Torah. So therefore, he limited himself to adding only 100 more chariots, which is 400 horses. And the rest of them he hamstringed. The Mefarshim say here they didn't kill the horses because that would be needless. However, he did have to injure them so they can't be used again, because then the enemy will use them again against the Jews. So it was kind of like an in-between. On the one hand, we want to preserve the life of the animal. On the other hand, we are going to hamstring it to make it incapable of pulling chariots again. So they won't use it against us. Okay. Forging forth, Pasuk Hey. Latavo Aram Damesek, Lazor Ladad Ezer Melech Tzova. Aram, the Arameans, get in the fight. And they try to support the king of Tzova, and David strikes them as well. Esrim Mishnayim Elef, 22,000 people. Incredible numbers here. In Chronicles, there was even more added. It was an incredible military victory. Vayasem David Netzivim ba'aram Damesek, v'ti aram LaDavid la'avadim nosei mincha. And David placed Netzivim in those areas in Aram, which again, I believe is like around Lebanon. He placed Netzivim. And Netziv in English is called an authority. A Netziv just means to stand there, people who stood there, like authorities that were in the enemy's territory to make sure that they don't get out of line, that they're still paying their taxes to David and the Jewish people, that they're not planning any revolts, right? He had representatives of the Jews sitting in their territory.
That's the Sedra this week, Nitzavim, right?
Oh, very good. Yeah, shkoyach. So in our Sedra, it means everybody here was standing, and over here it means he appointed people to stand there and watch.
Huh?
Shkoyach, yeah. Vayikach David et shiltei hazahav. Oh, sorry, we skipped the pasuk. Vayosha Hashem et David b'chol asher halach. That's very important. End of the verse, number 6. Hashem saved David everywhere he went. What's the English here? Hashem caused salvation for David wherever he went. Yeah. Vayikach David et shiltei hazahav asher hayu al avdei hadad azer vayaviem Yerushalayim. Here's a classic move by David HaMelech. He took the golden shields or quivers, depending how you translate, and where did he bring them to? Not back to his own treasury. He brought them to Yerushalayim, where the temple will be built. The gold that he got from the battles, he consecrated it. And he said, let this be dedicated for the Beis HaMikdash. We need materials to build it. We're going to need a lot of gold to make it a fancy building. So he took these military winds and he dedicated them to the Beis HaMikdash. Again, if I can't build it with my own hands, I will at least do all the preparation possible to make it happen. So he clears out Yerushalayim, and now he's bringing materials to build the Beis HaMikdash.
How do we know that Hashem didn't object to having products of warfare used?
That's a fascinating point. That's a good point. We don't know. It's interesting because David, why couldn't he build a temple? Because his hands are filled with blood and war. And now you're taking the products of war and you're bringing them to build the temple itself. That's a fascinating point, which I'm noting, but I have nothing to answer back. Good question. Yeah.
I think I have an answer, a possible answer.
Go ahead.
The pasuk says, "V'mizbach avanim taseh li lo taseh hen gazit ki charbecha," right, etc. The pasuk says you're not allowed to use metal implements to hew the stone for the mizbeach because metal is used in war. But there is no restriction in the pasuk of using anything else related to war except for that one explicit mention of the mizbeach.
I hear. Good. So the man of war can't build a temple, but the stuff you get as a result of war, other than using swords itself, that would be fine. Very good. There actually is a technical discussion here, and maybe this is an additional answer. Davar, I forgot the expression in the Gemara, something that was used for a mundane use. Like if I have a nice challah knife and I'm just using it for my own stuff, if I took that to the Beis HaMikdash, they would not be allowed to sharpen it and make it a shechita knife or make it a tool for the Beis HaMikdash. You can't use a tool that was used for a mundane purpose and transfer it to the Beis HaMikdash, and they use that same tool for the Beis HaMikdash. So here we seemingly have the same problem. You have the golden vessels that were used for mundane purposes by the Aramim, right? By the enemies up north. They were using these things for various purposes. And now we're taking them and bringing them to Yerushalayim. So how is that allowed? So the answer is they're not using them in their form. They're being melted down and reformed for whatever the purpose they would be used in the Beis HaMikdash. And it could be, to answer your question, Mr. Wolpert, that once you melt down the gold, it kind of loses its whatever history it had, and now you're reforming it. Here, it's like almost like koshering a vessel.
Yeah.
You take out any impurities. Okay. Good question. Thank you, Moshe. Thank you, Mr. Wolpert. All right. Vaikach David. That was verse number 7. Now we're in verse number 8. David took a lot of copper. It could be another reason he was dedicating it to the temple rather than taking it for himself, is because, again, another prohibition is that a king cannot have too much money. Not too many wives, not too many horses, and not too much money. So he couldn't keep this for himself, so he gave it to the Beis HaMikdash. Vaishma to'i melech chamat. So here comes a friend who appreciates what David is doing. There was a man named To'i, the king of Chamat, who was in that region that David was fighting. And he said, "Hey, David, thanks for killing my enemies." Right? He had also issues with Hadadezer. And so now he comes to give a gift to David to say thank you, to thank David for killing his enemy. Right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It also could be that To'i was terrified because you have here David who's absolutely dominating anybody who he faces in war. Hashem is with him and he's dominating everyone. So To'i gets the idea and he says, "I'm not going to fight this guy. Let me just give him a gift." So he says, "Thank you for fighting against my enemy. Here's a gift." Vaishlach, so this is verse number 10. Vaishlach To'i et Yoram beno el hamelech. David sends his son to wish him peace and bless him for fighting against his enemy. And he gives him klei kesef u'klei zahav u'klei nechoshet. He gives him a gift of silver, gold, and bronze. And verse number 11, also those, David, not only the stuff he won in war, which you could argue Hashem won those wars for me, but even the personal gifts that he got from To'i, the king of Chamat, he'd sanctified and made them for the Beis HaMikdash so that they should be used to build a temple and to furnish it. Okay. And now in verse number 12, it gives a list of all of the goyim, all of the nations that David had conquered, and the property which he was sanctifying to the Beis HaMikdash. Aram, which we just saw, that's the north. Moab, that's the east. Ammon, also the east. Plishtim, the Philistines we know too well. And Amalek. Umishlal Hadadezer ben Rechob melech Tzava, as well as Hadadezer, which we just read about. So somehow Amalek just made it onto the list. And we don't see in this chapter that Amalek had been fought against. Seemingly what this is referring to is the last time David fought against Amalek was when he was living amongst the Plishtim in Gat, and he was doing these little skirmishes to just go fight against Amalek, under the guise of being on the side of the Plishtim. It's an old war we're talking about, in other words. And he saved that stuff, and now he's dedicating it to the Beis HaMikdash. Okay. Vayas David Shem, and David made a great name. Beshuvo Ma'akatot Aram Begei Melech, when he returned from striking the enemy. David made a great name. So, reading the text simply, you would interpret this to mean he's a military giant. He's strong, he's powerful, and he's a popular military leader. However, the Gemara says that Yas David Shem means he became known as a merciful and righteous leader amongst the other nations. Why? Because they were burying the dead of the enemy. After the war, after all is said and done, the Jews, David commanded his soldiers to bury the enemies, to give them a proper burial. And this, especially in those days. Nowadays, you have, different rules of war. I don't know what they say about this. But in those days, especially, anything goes in war. There's no rules guiding. You do whatever you want. And David, unprecedented, he had the enemies buried. While they're alive, you fight against them. You do what's necessary. But once they're dead, you give them proper kavod, which is a remarkable thing. We had a couple of weeks ago the importance of being buried, that if a body must be hanged after you execute somebody, sometimes it's necessary to hang them. But nevertheless, you don't leave it hanging overnight, because they're at Tselem Elokim. At the end of the day, God created humans in his image, so to speak. And there's something very holy about the body of a person. And it's improper to treat it with disrespect, even if it's the body of your enemy. And therefore, David would take these bodies and he would bury them. Vayas David Shem, he made a name for himself as a merciful and righteous person. So he's finding favor in the eyes of everyone. Okay, number 14. Vayasem be'edom netzivim b'chol edom sam netzivim. Now suddenly we have mention of Edom. Edom is in the south. David comes back into Eretz Yisrael from the north and from the east, and now he goes southward towards Edom. And it says that he placed a lot of authorities. Bechol Edom sam netzivim. It sounds like the other enemies that he conquered, okay, you could leave one or two guys, like ambassadors, and everybody will behave. But when it comes to Edom, the descendants of Esav, they would act up a lot. So David had to have a lot. In all areas of Edom, he had to have a lot of Jewish authority and a lot of Jewish presence to make sure that Esav stayed down and wouldn't fight back and wouldn't rebel, etc. So you needed extra attention given to the people of Esav. Vayichol Edom avadim LeDavid, and all of Edom were enslaved to David. Vayosha Hashem et David b'chol asher alach. And once again, it says Hashem saved David in everywhere he went. I saw here, I'm trying to remember, maybe they bring it. Yeah, here, a beautiful note. I'll read to you straight from the Art Scroll, this volume, the blue one. It says, Hashem promised Abraham that his offspring would inherit not only the 7 Canaanite nations, but also the Keni, the Kenizi, and the Kadmoni. These 3 territories will become part of Eretz Yisrael with the coming of Mashiach. So by subjugating these 3 nations, David set the stage for future redemption. David here was not just securing the land in a practical point, but he was also thinking ahead nationally, that he knew that Hashem wanted to give all of this territory to the Jewish people, and that these 3 nations should be subservient to the Jews, and we should have their territory. So David was laying the foundations for that as well. He was, so to speak, like planting into history that we should have dominance over those nations, including Edom.
Dominance, but also justice.
Yes, right, correct. Verse number 15. Vayimlach David al kol Yisrael. David ruled over all of Yisrael. Vahid David oseh mishpat u'tzedakah lechol amo. We've had this expression, Vayimlach David al kol Yisrael. Originally, there were 2 kings, one from Shaul, one from David. And when Ishbosheth was out of the picture, David ruled over all of Israel. But now it says it again. Perhaps after all of this campaigning, like he had become even more popular. Like the numbers were through the roof. Yeah, everybody was streaming towards him. Everybody appreciated David. even in his most vicious, military state, he was still righteous, he was still kind, and he was still dedicating everything to the base of Mikdash. They saw that no amount of success would bend the heart of David. An incredible testament to his righteousness. And then it says, "Vahi David oseh mishpat u'tzedakah lechol amo." So David would do justice and kindness to all of his nation. Now, justice and kindness, mishpat u'tzedakah, could be contradictory, because justice sometimes demands harshness. He wins, he loses. So it's very unkind for the person who lost. So how could you do mishpat and tzedakah simultaneously? So the Gemara describes that when the litigants would come before David, he would judge them, and one person would be guilty and one innocent. So he would say, okay, you owe the money, you must pay up. But if it would be that the person who lost was poor, then David HaMelech would give him money to pay. So he made sure that justice was served, that the person who deserves to win according to the Torah law wins, but also he would make sure that if somebody was in hard times financially, David would support him from his own pocket, which is remarkable. Rav Lichtenstein shared that Rav Chaim of Brisk once paskined a shaila, he once ruled a halachic ruling that was not like the popular psak, like the shach. He ruled against the shach because Rav Chaim understood differently, and he was of the level that he could argue on the accepted psak of the shach. So Rav Chaim ruled that the person loses the money, but he said, why should you lose money if I'm going not like the shach? So he paid. He himself took it out of his own pocket. The rabbi paid for the person who lost. Okay, a similar kind of story. If you appreciated it, you got it. Okay, now let's just finish up the chapter. There's a lot more to be said. We're just going to keep going. Verse number 16, Ve'yoav ben Tzruya al hatzava, Ve'yoshaphat ben Achilud mazkir. Now it goes like through the cabinet of David. Is that what it's called? The people who surround the king, the people who are in charge, the officers of David. And it says, Yoav ben Tzruya was al hatzava. This is a continuation of the previous verse. David was able to rule justly and to spend time taking care of the justice because he had such a competent military leader. He had Yoav ben Tzruya, who was taking care of the war and the fighting and the security, that David could focus on guiding the nation in terms of mishpat u'tzedakah. Then he had Yoshaphat ben Achilud mazkir. The word mazkir means the reminder. In modern Hebrew, it means secretary. It means the person who keeps records, whether it's who owes money, who was judged, or writing down like the history of the king. That was his job, and it lists the rest of them. They did not all serve at this time. I think this is talking a wide view because some of these people were very young at this stage. And it ends off with Benayahu ben Yehoyada, who was the war general. Again, must have been later, Vakretiva Pleti, which either refers to the Urim V'Tumim or the Sanhedrin, Ubnei David Kohanim Hayu. And the sons of David were Kohanim. So that can't be, because David is from the tribe of Yehuda, not Levi, so his sons cannot be Kohanim. Here, Kohen is the generic term, not a descendant of Aaron. It means a minister, somebody who's a leader. The sons of David were leaders. In English, they translate as senior ministers. Okay. So this is just describing the people who surrounded him. They were actually quite righteous. Benayahu ben Yehoyada is praised not only for his military victories, but also for his Torah knowledge. So they always go hand in hand in Tanakh. It's a fascinating thing. Okay, so Bezrat Hashem, we have learned about David securing the borders of Eretz Yisrael by fighting the north, the east, the south. He stayed righteous, and he was able to imbue righteousness into the nation through his own judgments. And God willing, not next week, but the following week, next year, we will pick up with chapter 9 with a very fascinating account of paying Shaul's descendants. All right, I wish you all a ketiva v'chatima tova. May you be written and inscribed for life. It should be a year of growth and health and simcha and bracha for all of you.
All the Yidden.
All the Yidden. And Yeshua, salvation. Shkoyach.
For everyone.